It began, not with a scream, not with a scandal, but with silence. The kind that creeps into the walls of a home, into the spaces between two people who once loved loudly. For decades, Emma Thompson was the face of poised resilience, an Oscar-winning actress, a fierce advocate for women's rights, and a mother who fought for balance in a world that demanded constant reinvention. But now, in her early 60s, with a career still gleaming under stage lights and silver screens, she finds herself confronting a truth more painful than any role she has ever played: the end of her marriage to Greg Wise. The world knew them as the golden couple of British cinema. Emma and Greg, intellectual, witty, fiercely private. But behind the graceful smiles on red carpets and carefully curated public appearances was a slow, almost invisible unraveling. For years, Emma buried herself in her work, film after film, script after script. She portrayed grief, joy, complexity, and madness, but never did she allow the cracks in her own life to show. That was her shield, her code. Yet something changed after the pandemic. When the film sets shut down and travel stopped, Emma was home more, home with Greg, with the silence, with the distance. She had always suspected there were truths left unspoken between them, but time had become their best excuse. Now, time was the enemy. It forced them to sit with the truth. Emma has always been open about her past struggles, with depression, with betrayal, with the pressures of being a woman in a ruthless industry. But this grief, felt different. It wasn't just the breaking of a romantic bond. It was the collapse of a sanctuary she had built with Greg over nearly 30 years, fortified by shared values, late-night conversations, and 2 children who had been her compass through the darkest storms. The most devastating moment came, as she recounts quietly in a recent interview, not with a fight, but with a look from Greg that she didn't recognize, cold, distant, as though he'd already left months before saying the words out loud. And when those words finally came, "I don't think we're happy anymore." It wasn't anger Emma felt, it was release. And then, the crushing emptiness. Friends close to the couple revealed that the spark between them had dimmed long ago, replaced by routine, mutual obligations, and the heavy weight of unfulfilled emotional needs. Greg, who had long struggled with his own identity outside of Emma's shadow, reportedly drifted further into solitude. And Emma, ever the optimist, kept hoping that one more family holiday, one more quiet night in, one more project might bring them back. But instead, the emotional toll became unbearable. Emma began withdrawing from roles that once brought her joy. On the set of her most recent film, she was described by insiders as present but haunted, a woman performing the act of being herself. She smiled when asked about Greg but avoided any real conversation. The real Emma, sharp, unfiltered, passionate, had retreated. What no one knew until now was that the breaking point had been quietly building behind closed doors. The children, now grown, had seen the shift, but were powerless to stop it. The once vibrant dinners filled with laughter had turned into meals eaten in silence. Emma, known for her emotional strength, found herself crying in dressing rooms, on long drives, and in the early morning hours when the world was still asleep. Then came the decision. It wasn't impulsive. It was heartbreakingly calculated. She filed for divorce in private, informing only her closest confidants. She did not want to shame Greg. She did not want the headlines. But she also did not want to keep bleeding quietly in the shadows of a relationship that no longer nurtured her spirit. "This is not about blame," she told a friend. "It's about survival." And yet, it is about pain. The kind that sneaks up on you in your 60s when you thought the worst of life's wounds had already come and gone. Emma Thompson, whose career has spanned decades, who has portrayed queens, warriors, and grieving mothers, now finds herself in a role she never auditioned for. A woman starting over, not in youth, but in maturity. Those closest to her say that she walks differently now, slower, more contemplative. She has taken to spending mornings alone in a small garden behind her London home. She drinks her tea in silence, stares out at the roses she planted years ago with Greg, and wonders which memories are hers to keep, and which she must now let go. And as the world begins to piece together this quiet collapse of a once revered partnership, questions arise. Was the love ever truly mutual? Did the sacrifices she made, professionally, emotionally, go unseen? Did Greg ever feel overshadowed by her brilliance? Or worse, did he stop seeing her altogether? The answers remain unclear. Emma herself seems reluctant to place blame or claim victimhood. She simply says, "It's time." Time? For what? She doesn't say. But those who know her know this. Emma Thompson may be heartbroken, but she is not broken. She is shedding, like the leaves outside her window in autumn, like a woman stepping into the last act of her life, not as a wife, but as herself. And still, the world waits for her next move, with bated breath, with empathy, with a sense that something far deeper than a divorce has just been revealed. She still kept his toothbrush by the sink, not because she expected him to return, but because throwing it away would feel too final. It stood there like a relic, bristles frayed, toothpaste residue clinging to its neck, quietly marking the absence that now haunted her mornings. These were the small things that lingered, refusing to let the heartbreak settle into something neat or tidy. In the early hours, before the world demanded anything of her, Emma would sit by the window in her dressing gown, legs tucked under her like a schoolgirl, sipping tea from the chipped mug Greg had given her their first Christmas together. "It suits you. Sturdy and hard to break," he'd said back then with a cheeky grin. Now, the mug was a weight in her hand, and the memory of his words pressed hard against her chest. She didn't cry often, not because she didn't feel the pain, but because the tears seemed inadequate. The grief wasn't loud. It was quiet, aching, like a bruise that deepens over days. It lived in the corners of her home. The coat he forgot to take, the books she bought him that now sat unopened, the garden tools still rusting where he last left them in spring. Even the cat, old and half-blind, kept wandering into his study, meowing softly as if asking, "Where did he go?" Emma tried to carry on. She returned to work, reluctantly, cautiously. On set, she was professional as ever, but her co-stars noticed she lingered longer between takes, staring into the distance, fingers twitching at the hem of her sleeve. A young actor once asked if she was all right. She smiled, tight-lipped, weary, and replied, "I'm just adjusting to silence." She didn't speak much about Greg to others. When asked, she'd redirect the conversation, make a joke, shift the light away from her own shadows. But in her journals, stacked high beside her bed, she wrote furiously. She wrote about the moments most people forget, the way his hand twitched in sleep, the precise angle he held his head when he was reading, the scent of the oil he used on his beard. She wrote them down not to hold on, but to let go gently, piece by piece. It hadn't always been this way. They'd once danced in the kitchen, barefoot and giddy, while their children laughed and rolled their eyes. She remembered how he used to sing off-key just to make her laugh, and how they'd argued over everything from politics to which film to watch on a Saturday night. Their life had texture, richness, and even in its cracks, it had meaning. But something changed. She couldn't trace it to a single moment. It was more like erosion. The slow wearing away of connection, the widening of emotional distance, like tectonic plates drifting apart beneath the surface. They stopped reaching for each other. She blamed herself sometimes, too busy, too intense, too focused on the world's problems to notice the ones under her roof. Other times, she wondered if he had simply fallen out of love and stayed out of duty. The hardest part was watching her children navigate the divide. Though grown, they looked at her with questions they dared not ask. Was love always this fragile? Would they end up like her? Strong but alone, dignified but exhausted? Emma hated that they had to witness her unraveling. She had tried so hard to give them a picture of love that was imperfect but enduring. Now, she feared she had given them a cautionary tale. Still, she held on to small rituals. She read poetry at night, Rilke, Plath, sometimes Neruda. She found solace in words, in their ability to make suffering feel universal, survivable. She walked every morning, rain or shine, through Hampstead Heath, scarf pulled high, sunglasses shielding eyes not from the sun, but from recognition. She wasn't ready to be consoled by strangers or whispered about in cafes. Some mornings, she'd pass couples walking hand in hand, and something in her would tighten. Not envy. No, never envy. But mourning. Not just for what she lost, but for the version of herself she had been with him. The woman who once believed she could make anything last if she tried hard enough. Back home, she took to repainting a wall in the hallway. It was Greg's job once, but he never got around to it. So she bought the brushes, the drop cloth, a tin of soft sage green, and did it herself. Stroke by stroke, she covered the old marks, the fingerprints, the scuffs from years of life lived together. It wasn't symbolic, at least not intentionally, but by the end, as she stood back and looked at her work, she felt something lift. Not peace, not yet, but movement. Emma Thompson, the woman, not the actress, was rebuilding in whispers, in freshly painted walls, in the creak of floorboards beneath her feet, in the deliberate act of cooking dinner for one and eating it without apology. She didn't need to be rescued, nor did she seek reinvention. She wanted simply to feel real again. At night, when the house grew still, she'd sometimes find herself reaching for the other side of the bed out of habit. It would always be cold. She'd lie there, eyes fixed on the ceiling, remembering that the bravest thing she had done in a long time wasn't surviving the end. It was choosing it. And still, the world didn't know the whole story. Not yet. Because Emma Thompson, though public in her career, has always been private in her pain. But she's starting to speak, not with drama, not with bitterness, but with the quiet authority of a woman who has walked through fire and come out, not unscathed, but standing. What comes next for Emma is unclear. A new chapter, yes, but written in her own time, in her own words. For now, she lives between heartbreak and hope, in the liminal space where grief becomes growth, and silence becomes something else entirely. Power. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's where the real story begins. But something was still missing. Not in the way one misses a person, but in the way one misses a version of themselves. A self that once existed in the shared rituals of a relationship now dissolved. Emma would often pause mid-conversation, mid-thought, as if hearing an echo from a room she no longer entered. And there were many rooms like that now, both literal and metaphorical, spaces she tiptoed around, unsure whether to reclaim or leave untouched. She had started keeping her phone off at night. It wasn't a declaration, more a quiet refusal. Of what? Even she wasn't sure. Attention? Pity? Questions she wasn't ready to answer? She wasn't prepared to perform grief in public. Not yet. Especially not the kind of grief that comes when the person you lost is still alive and breathing, just no longer yours. Every now and then, Greg would send a message. Not long, not cruel. Just the kind that threads itself into your thoughts for hours afterward. Just thinking about the camellias. Did they bloom this year? Emma would stare at the screen. She wouldn't reply. Not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know which Emma he was writing to. The woman who once laughed beside him in the garden, or the woman who now stood alone in it, unsure if the flowers were blooming or dying. She had taken to sleeping with the radio on. Something soft. Late-night programs with calm voices reading out poetry or old letters. Sometimes she imagined those letters were meant for her. That someone, somewhere, was trying to tell her that the ache she carried wasn't hers alone. That other people were also waking up at 3 a.m., walking to the kitchen barefoot, looking for something they couldn't name. There were things left unsaid between her and Greg. Volumes of them. And the silence around those things had its own weight. She'd find herself rewinding conversations in her mind, looking for clues. When had he stopped meeting her eyes across the table? When did his hands stop lingering at her back? Did he fall out of love, or simply grow tired of pretending? And, most terrifying of all, did she, perhaps, do the same? Their daughter had visited recently. She'd looked around the house like she was studying an old museum. "Everything's exactly the same," she'd said, running her fingers along the bookshelf. "Except, it's not." Emma had smiled. That half-smile she'd mastered over the years, the one that said, "Yes, you're right," without needing to explain further. There were whispers, of course. There always are. Whispers about why it ended, what he did, what she didn't. Some tabloids suggested betrayal, others boredom. None of them, she thought, got close to the truth. But then again, what is truth in a marriage? It is rarely one thing. It is 1,000 tiny choices, layered over years, until one day you wake up and realize you've painted yourselves into different corners. A director friend had offered her a role, a complex character. A woman at a crossroads, forced to choose between comfort and truth. Emma had declined. The irony was too cruel. "I'm living it," she'd said with a wry chuckle. No need to rehearse, and yet she wasn't idle. She had begun writing again. Not scripts, not speeches, just fragments, sentences without endings, characters without names, emotions torn from the marrow. It wasn't for publication, it was for breathing. Every afternoon, she walked the same path through Primrose Hill. Same turn by the rose garden, same bench near the old oak tree. She noticed the same couple sitting there every Thursday. An old man reading aloud to a woman who always looked half asleep. Emma wondered about them. Were they happy? Or were they simply practiced in the art of staying? Once, she lingered too long. The old man looked up and nodded at her, as if recognizing something in her expression. She nodded back, but quickly turned away. She wasn't ready to be known like that, not by a stranger, not even by herself. Greg had started appearing in her dreams again. Not the younger version of him, the one with wild hair and foolish ambition, but the man he was now. Quiet, tired, and somehow distant, even in sleep. In the dreams, they spoke, but she could never remember the words, only the feeling, regret, longing, relief. It changed each time. The house remained untouched. No furniture moved. No boxes packed. It was as if she was waiting for something. A sign, perhaps, or a truth she had missed. But none came. Only days, unfolding quietly like pages in a book she no longer recognized, but still read anyway. Sometimes Emma would sit in the car long after she'd parked, hands resting on the wheel, the engine off. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just sat, as if frozen in that space between motion and stillness, between leaving and returning. Those were the moments she felt most herself, and least. Her friends wanted to help, of course. Dinners, calls, invitations to retreats. She accepted some, declined most. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate them. It was that their kindness reminded her how visible her pain had become. And she wasn't ready for that kind of exposure. Not yet. In truth, Emma wasn't sure what she wanted. Closure? Justice? Forgiveness? Perhaps none of those. Perhaps only time. Time to reshape her days. Time to forget the shape of his voice. Time to become unfamiliar with the scent of his clothes. Time to stop asking herself whether she could have held on longer, or whether letting go had been the first act of mercy she'd shown herself in years. She had stopped marking anniversaries. She no longer noted the date they met, the date they married, the night he moved out. But her body remembered. A coldness in her chest every October, an ache in her wrists every spring. Memory, she discovered, lived in the bones more than the mind, and so she moved through each day like a ghost in her own life. Not unhappy, not joyful, just in between. What came next would reveal itself eventually. A phone call, a letter, a revelation, or maybe nothing at all. Maybe the answer was not in knowing, but in simply being, sitting with the ache, letting it pass through, and learning, somehow, to breathe around it. But for now, the curtains remained drawn just slightly. The kettle still whistled each morning, and in the stillness of her home, Emma Thompson waited, not for Greg, not for closure, but for something unnamed, just beyond reach. And perhaps, still listening. It was seconds. In the fog of sleep, she was back to the beginning, before the slow decay, before the silence, before the distance. Then the truth would rush in like cold water, and she'd lie there, eyes open, staring at the dark ceiling, trying to memorize the sound of nothing. She had begun seeing a therapist. Not regularly, just when the quiet got too loud. They didn't talk much about Greg. They talked about fear, about identity, about how, even as a woman of enormous talent and presence, Emma still felt like she had to earn the right to be fully herself outside of love. "Do you miss him?" the therapist asked once. She had paused, then said, "I miss the version of me I used to be when I thought he saw me." But did he ever really see her? The question sat with her for weeks, showing up in the smallest of places. A glance in the mirror, a forgotten photograph, a song on the radio. She began writing again, late at night, by candlelight. Pages and pages. Not of scripts, not of fiction, but of half-memories, unfinished thoughts, scenes with no resolution. She'd write until the candle flickered out, and the page was too blurred by tears to continue. There were still flashes of joy, a spontaneous laugh on the phone with an old friend, a child's drawing left behind in a cafe, the scent of lavender from a passerby that reminded her of a summer in Provence long ago. Life, she realized, continued to shimmer even in mourning, but it did so in fragments now, in moments too brief to hold on to. She stopped trying to explain her sadness. It had become its own language, one that didn't require translation, Friends still called, still invited her out, still sent flowers. Some she answered. Most she didn't. She didn't owe the world her healing on a schedule. She didn't owe anyone the performance of moving on. She had begun rearranging the books in her house, alphabetically, by author, by color, by theme. She didn't know why. Perhaps it was her way of reordering the chaos, of creating a structure where one no longer existed. One night, she found herself reading the same sentence from a Joan Didion essay over and over again. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. She wondered what story she was telling herself now. Was she a woman scorned, freed, broken, reborn? She didn't know. And maybe that was the point. Emma stood one morning in the doorway of the guest room. It still smelled like him. She hadn't entered since he left. The bed was untouched. His old dressing gown still hung behind the door. She stepped in slowly, opened the wardrobe, ran her fingers along the sleeves of his forgotten jackets. Then she closed it again. Not ready. Later that afternoon, she received a postcard in the mail. No return address, just a line scribbled on the back. Sometimes survival is the bravest thing. She pinned it above her desk, next to the note from the door, next to a photo of herself, 20 years younger, grinning under an umbrella in Edinburgh, rain falling hard, wind whipping her hair. Greg had taken the photo. She looked so free in it, so unaware of everything that would come after. She still didn't know what her next act would be, whether she'd return to the stage, whether she'd write a memoir, whether she'd open herself up to love again, or stay like this, adrift, yet strangely at peace. For now, she allowed herself to float. And in that floating, in the not knowing, in the quiet ache of an unfinished sentence, Emma Thompson remained, somewhere between grief and grace, between memory and reinvention. A woman paused mid-scene, eyes turned toward something distant, unknowable, perhaps unreachable. And maybe she didn't need to reach it. Maybe it was enough to simply wait. Or maybe, just maybe, she was already on her way.